Institute. And today we have a researcher from that institute. We will have two presentations today that will take 20 to 30 minutes each. We're trying to keep this within an hour, but please be aware that we may go over just a little bit. The first speaker we will hear from is Dr. Cheryl Heykoop, who is a research associate with the International Institute for Child Rights and Development, and also a research fellow with the Resiliency by Design Youth Innovation Lab. Dr. Heykoop is an associate faculty member in the School of Humanitarian Studies and the School of Leadership Studies at Royal Roads University. For the past 13 years, Cheryl has worked with young people affected by adversity in a number of countries: Uganda, Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, Thailand, Brazil, Canada, and the United States. And much of her work has focused on helping children and youth to safely and meaningfully share their stories and their insights related to conflicts, disasters, and other issues that affect them. She's worked with a wide range of organizations, from UNICEF to the Refugee Law Project, Plan International, government, civil society, and other academics. In 2008, Cheryl co-authored a research paper exploring young people's engagement in the Sierra Leone Truth Commission, which informed her award-winning doctoral research on using participatory approaches to explore the safe, meaningful engagement of young people in post-conflict truth-telling in northern Uganda. Cheryl holds a doctorate of social sciences from Royal Roads and a master's in humanitarian studies from Liverpool University. After Cheryl, we will take a few minutes of clarification questions and then hear from Virginie Ladisch of the International Center for Transitional Justice. We will have time for questions at the end. In the meantime, if you have questions or would like to participate in the chat box that you should see on your screen, please feel free to do so, and we'll be moderating those to get them into the presenters' hands at the end of their two presentations. Cheryl, Dr. Heykoop, over to you.
Mute myself, there we go. Okay, so thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's both an honor and a privilege to be here today speaking alongside Virginie. And thank you to Mark and Courtney and the rest of the CPCLN and IICRD for making this happen, and to each of our participants on the line for joining us. And I also want to offer a special thank you to Juliet, my research assistant and partner in crime, for being on the call. So she was instrumental in actually conducting this research in the field in Uganda. Second, before I begin, I just want to preface the discussion with a note stating that I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a social worker, which are some of the dominant professions in transitional justice and post-conflict healing and recovery. So, as Mark mentioned, I come to this as an interdisciplinary scholar practitioner, and it's in this capacity that I question if young people could be engaged in truth commissions in more supportive ways. I also feel quite strongly that young people have important insights and perspectives to share about how best to do this. So in my presentation today, I will offer some context into young people's participation in truth commissions. And I want to just note here I'm using the term young people rather than children and youth, because young people in our study actually felt that the term young people was more contextually appropriate and inclusive to describe themselves. I'm also going to share some results from this research and then identify some questions and some issues for further exploration and discussion. And I have to apologize, I do have a bit of cold, so if I'm coughing in between the presentation, just note that that's why. So to begin, I'd like to share with you a story that helps to really bring this research to life. And to do so, I invite you to travel with me to Sierra Leone to meet a young friend of mine. And as Mark mentioned, I did some research there looking at the impact of participation in truth commissions on children specifically. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll call her Sia. Now this isn't her real name, yet I'll use it to help protect her identity. Like many young people in Sierra Leone, Sia experienced the 11-year war firsthand. At the age of 12, she was abducted, and she was forced to fight for a cause she didn't believe in. She spent nearly 4 years in the bush. She watched as her mother was raped, and she was also forced to kill her father. And I know this story is difficult to hear, yet it represents the experiences of so many young people affected by conflict. Their stories are. Now, when wars and conflict end, truth commissions are typically established. Historically, young people haven't been involved in this process, yet the Sierra Leone Truth Commission changed that, where for the first time ever, young people like Sia could provide statements to the Truth Commission and share their experiences. And since Truth Commissions in Liberia, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and others have systematically gathered statements from young people, there's a recognition that learning from young people about how they've been affected by the conflict is important. Their stories matter. Yet how does this engagement affect the young people who participate? At what cost? When I asked Sia about her experience, she said, "They came and I was asked to talk. I didn't know it was going to happen. They called out my name, they recorded my voice, and they used a video camera. The film was shown in the community, and the moment I saw it, I felt bad. People were pointing fingers at me. I didn't expect it to happen that way. I wouldn't do it again." And while not all young people who participate in truth commissions have experiences like Sia's, for example, children can be involved in a variety of ways, through outreach, through official submissions, through creative workshops. Individual statement taking is the most widely used method, and it's considered to be a proven and effective way for young people to express their views and to contribute to an understanding of how young people have been affected by conflict. Unfortunately, to date, there's limited empirical evidence exploring how statement taking actually affects young people and the adults who participate. So of the research that does exist, the results are actually quite disconcerting. For some, post-conflict truth-telling may be beneficial, yet particularly in the context of truth commissions, individual statement taking is thought to negatively affect individuals. This is particularly worrisome for children, and further research is needed. So as duty bearers of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, how can we then best support young people's participation in ways that are safe and meaningful, and where young people like Sia can feel safe, respected, and protected? Furthermore, how can young people be active contributors in designing this process? So if we look to the words of Graça Machel, children have an important and unique role in processes that seek truth, justice, and reconciliation. Adults can act on behalf of children and in the best interests of children, but unless children themselves are consulted and engaged, we will fall short and undermine the potential to pursue the most relevant and durable solutions. So how can we involve children in designing this process? So I now turn to Northern Uganda, which is an opportune context to consider how to engage young people in post-conflict truth-telling or truth commissions differently. So Northern Uganda, as many of you probably know, was affected by 20 years of civil war, and young people were disproportionately affected. It's estimated that between 24,000 to 6,000 young people were forcibly abducted, nearly 90% of the population was displaced, and virtually all young people witnessed and experienced violence and lived amidst poverty and fear. Fortunately, since 2006, Northern Uganda has experienced relative peace, and the country is now exploring, hopefully, how post-conflict truth-telling processes such as truth commissions can be applied to fully understand what happened. Given how young people were affected, their voices are important. And as one research participant noted, the war did not leave out children and youth, so if you exclude young people, you're leaving out a vital part of the story. So specifically, our research sought to achieve 3 objectives. We sought to understand young people's perspectives about their engagement in post-conflict truth-telling. We sought to develop a contextually appropriate model for young people to do this safely and meaningfully. And then we sought to work with young people and key adults to reflect upon and facilitate changes to how young people are engaging in post-conflict truth-telling in Uganda, but globally. And we did this really through 6 key questions. So how are young people currently sharing or not sharing about the past? If young people were to share, how would they want to do that? Through what methods, through what contexts, conditions, and with what results? And what are the things that young people would want to share and not want to share, and why? How do factors of gender, age, and one's role during the conflict affect one's desire to share? And then how do these perspectives facilitate changes to policy and programs? And how can they specifically affect policies and processes in Uganda? So the processes reflect the needs and desires of young people as articulated by young people themselves. So in the research, we engaged 107 young people, And these young people ranged in age between 11 to 23. And the reason why we looked at upwards of 23 is because those who were 18 when the conflict ended would have been children at the time. So that's why we looked at that age group. Specifically, we included 4 categories of groups of young people following our pilot. So we looked at young people who were formerly abducted, those who were internally displaced, those who were disabled as a result of the war, and then those born in captivity. And it's important to note that the last 2 categories of young people, those disabled as a result of the war and those born in captivity, are rarely included in post-conflict research. This is shifting, but it's quite rare still. So how did we do this research? So to conduct the research, we applied a participatory action research methodology. And in particular, we chose PAR because it values young people as experts in their own lives, and it's action-oriented, helping to identify relevant solutions. Now, with each group of young people, we conducted 10 full-day research sessions and used a variety of participatory activities to do so. So, for example, on the photo on the right, you'll see a young boy actually presenting the places, spaces, and activities where he felt young people would feel free and safe to share about their experiences during the conflict. Young people were also involved in data analysis, and verification workshops were held with each group of participants to further explore and discuss the responses to key questions such as why should young people share? How should young people share? And a workshop with all participants was held at the end of the work to then identify strategies to move the research forward. I wanted to just highlight here on this slide 2 examples of different other ways that we involved young people. So the image on the left is what we called the sharing stoplight. So what are the ways that you would freely share about the past? What are the ways that you would share about the past cautiously and then not at all? And young people actually advised how they would recommend that other people share. They didn't want to necessarily share about their own experiences. To the right is an image from one of the verification sessions. So essentially, taking all the information and then organizing it according to those key themes. And there was a lot of prioritization of who, where, what are the key priorities, what are the reasons why children would share, etc. So what did we learn through the research? And I mean, in general, we learned how young people themselves would design a truth-telling process. And this in and of itself is important because young people have never systematically been engaged in the design of a process to support young people's safe and meaningful engagement. Now, to share young people's insights, I've organized the research into 4 action-oriented themes. And for each theme, I've organized the key recommendations, and these are listed on the slides. Now, because of time, I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations. I'm going to note those that I consider to be most interesting, important, and are relevant. And then you can actually read more about these findings in our forthcoming article coming out this summer. So in relation to meaningful engagement, we've learned that young people want opportunities to participate. There's no surprise, but having opportunities does not necessarily directly correlate to engagement. Some people don't want to share about the past. And in particular, young people born in captivity feared that sharing about the past and about their parents specifically could result in being insulted and stigmatized and could pose problems in community. As such, they felt they would not likely participate if a process was set up in Uganda. And this is important because it acknowledges a potential challenge that a truth commission may face in its quest to gather a full and impartial narrative of the past, which is one of the primary objectives of truth commissions. Oops. Secondly, young people reiterated the importance of ongoing and repeated opportunities for engagement, where engagement and ongoing opportunities can help generate feelings of trust and comfort to share their perspectives and views. So for example, one participant reflecting on the process said, when we started this research, I used to be very shy and fearful, and I thought I would never say anything during the session. But it reached a time when I felt I gained some encouragement, and I now feel I'm capable of speaking out my mind freely and without any fear. And this is quite interesting because while young people have advocated for multiple engagement opportunities, past truth commissions have engaged young people via one interaction through statement taking. And actually the Paris Principles recommends that multiple engagements be avoided when working with young people affected by armed conflict. Lastly, in reference to meaningful engagement, I want to highlight how participants themselves felt that it was critical to engage young people in determining how to involve young people. And they thought that this was really important to ensure that decisions made respected the best interests of young people. I now turn to the second group of themes, really focusing on balancing participation and protection. So in previous Truth Commissions, special protection measures have been granted to all young people who are under the age of 18 at the time of the conflict. Or sorry, at the time of the Truth Commission, not the conflict. Yet participants in our research recommend that the focus should be on one's age during the conflict and not one's age when the Truth Commission is set up. So for example, if someone is 15 at the time of the conflict, but yet is 23 when the Truth Commission set up, those special measures wouldn't be necessarily implemented. And that was definitely a cause of concern for the young people. Young people also noted the importance of maintaining confidentiality. So for example, in Liberia, in the Truth Commission, statements shared would be confidential for 20 years and then they would be released. And as one participant noted, it was like, so if I was 18 when the Truth Commission happened and then I'm 38, how will then that information being released affect my own children and my family? So again, something that's important to consider moving forward. Young people also felt it was important that all young people will be viewed as victims and witnesses. And I don't necessarily agree with this, and I'll come back to this point in a moment. But I do think it's important to mention because young people themselves noted this. And they felt because they were forcibly abducted, they were forced to then commit the crimes. So as one young person noted, we were forced to kill the abductee. We were forced to kill innocent people from there. So from my perspective, while this recommendation warrants consideration, it's also important to note that some people who were abducted as children were and are high-ranking members of, say, the Lord's Resistance Army, and they've committed grave human rights violations. And I think Dominic Ongwen is a case in point in this. So applying a blanket clause which states that everyone who was abducted as a child will be considered as victims and witnesses primarily, will likely have serious implications on healing and reconciliation. I now then turn to theme 3, which is improving well-being and facilitating healing. So in reference to this theme, participants noted that simply sharing is not enough. Young people want to see tangible changes in their lives, like assistance and follow-up, and they want to feel free from stigmatization, finger-pointing, and community mistrust. I think you'll likely hear more about this when Virginie is giving her presentation in a moment. Conversely, if there's no support, many young people in our study felt that they wouldn't participate in a truth-telling process. So for example, when I proposed to participants that a truth-telling process would hear about the past and would not offer support, one participant said, this would be time wasting. It will just hurt. If there's no assistance, then there's no need to talk about what happened. Now this is important because in previous Truth Commissions, young people have not received assistance in exchange for the engagement. Now, the newly established Kampala recommendations do highlight the importance of acknowledging young people, yet this recommendation has not yet been put into practice to the best of my knowledge. In reference to healing, we've also learned that healing must occur at the level of the individual and the community. And for young people in Uganda, the community involves both the living and the dead. So recognizing the dead is also important, because several participants talked about being haunted by the spirits, or the concept referred to as Chen. So for post-conflict truth-telling processes, to truly facilitate healing, recognition must be given to the cultural traditions and realities. And this has had a limited focus in previous Truth Commissions. Again, there are attempts being made. So that leads me to my final theme, which is strengthen the evidence base. And specifically, rather than plunging into action, I would argue for an approach to engaging young people that is grounded in research about how engagement affects young people in the short, medium, and long term, because this research doesn't necessarily exist now. And I would argue that it's actually unethical to continue to apply the same methods that have been used previously. I would also suggest that given extensive research has been done in northern Uganda and other countries affected by conflict, how can this information be used in the context of a Truth Commission? And how can young people's engagement then help build their capacity as active citizens and enhance their resilience. So not necessarily just involving them to hear their stories, but also how can they contribute to strengthening their communities and being active agents in the peace-building process. So now I want to quickly just turn to some of the changes that have occurred or emerged through the research process. Young people have noted that they have increased confidence to share. Refugee Law Project, who is our partner organization in this, now actually has a specific focus on young people, which they didn't have necessarily a couple of years ago, so it's great to see this focus now within the organization. They recognize the importance. Young people were also actively engaged in drafting the Uganda Transitional Justice Policy, and the preliminary findings of this research have also informed the Kampala recommendations, which are recommendations focused on engaging young people affected by conflict. So some additional questions to consider, sort of what methods could be used to generate evidence for truth commissions that reflects the needs of young people, communities, and truth commissions. So rather than focusing on what truth commissions need, how can these be harmonized with what young people and communities need as well? How can young people who committed atrocities be held accountable in ways that are supportive and restorative? How can we safely and meaningfully engage adults in truth commissions who experience violence and conflict as children? Because, in many ways, if we look at the research, they still experience those experiences as children. So how do we involve them in ways that are safe and meaningful, recognizing this? And then how can young people contribute in ways that are ethical and meaningful for them? How can young people's engagement build their capacity as active citizens and enhance their resilience? So in short, through the research, we've learned that the perspectives and experiences of young people are important. Yet in the spirit of the CRC and Article 12 specifically, the views of young people must be heard and considered in ways that are ethical and meaningful for them. So how then do we involve them in this process? So in closing, I wish to extend a heartfelt gratitude to everyone on the call. And I also wish to thank the 107 young people who were involved. I want to thank them for sharing their wisdom. And I hope that I've shared their insights and perspectives in a way that makes those young people proud, because I've certainly been proud and inspired by each of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was a lovely presentation, and also just nice to have the voices of children incorporated throughout so that we could not only hear the analysis that grew out of all of the children's stories, but also hear specific instances of things that children had said, young people had said. I want to give an opportunity to everyone to type clarification questions in the chat box. Please do so momentarily before we move on to the next presentation by Virginie Ladisch. And please also keep typing your questions and thoughts at a broader level for Cheryl and Virginie in the chat box, and we will bring those to the group at the end. We don't seem to have any clarification questions for the time being, so I will introduce Virginie Ladisch, who leads the International Center for Transitional Justice's work on children and youth. In that capacity, she's provided support on how to engage children and youth in transitional justice processes in a number of countries. I'll just list them here for you because it's quite impressive. Canada, Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Liberia, Myanmar, Nepal, and Tunisia. From the time she joined the ICTJ in 2006 until 2009, she worked as part of the reparations program and then headed the Cyprus and Turkey country programs. Prior to joining the ICTJ, Virginie was awarded a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship for Independent Research and carried out extensive fieldwork on truth commissions and reconciliation in South Africa and Guatemala. The results of her research on the challenges of reconciliation have been published in a number of reviews, the Journal of Public and International Affairs, the Cyprus Review, and more recently publications on the engagement of children and youth in transitional justice in the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth. Virginie holds a Master's in International Affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. With no further ado, Virginie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction, and thanks, Cheryl, for your presentation, and to all those on the line. I look forward to your questions at the end of both of our presentations later. So yes, as Mark mentioned, I head the Children and Youth Program here at ICTJ, and my main focus in that capacity is to ensure that what we call transitional justice processes, so processes intended to find accountability for past violations, to make sure that these processes consider the needs and perspectives of children and youth, both those who have been affected directly as victims, as well as the general population of youth who will be the ones to carry forward the recommendations that come out of these processes. So I think in Cheryl's really informative presentation, she was able to share some ideas about the challenges of truth-seeking and how to effectively engage young people in that process. And today I will focus on our recent work in northern Uganda as well, but on a slightly different topic, which is a bit more focused on redress or reparations, so that it is better understanding what are the long-term consequences of violations affecting children and young people, and then what steps can be taken to help overcome those challenges. Let me just try and get my, there we go. So in April 2015, ICTJ, we carried out an assessment to look at the long-term challenges and the unredressed justice needs of children born as a result of conflict-related sexual violence and their mothers. And we did this in part because there's been a lot of research on former child soldiers, but we found less so on the situation facing formerly abducted young mothers, and then even less on the children they came back with. So I don't have time to go into detail about the conflict in Uganda, but just briefly, there were many cases of children being abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army, and many of the girls or young women who were abducted ended up returning with children that they had conceived during captivity. And in addition to that, there were also instances of other children born of sexual violence committed at the hands of the government forces. And this is something that now that time has passed and most of the conflict, the intensity has waned, and as Cheryl mentioned, trying to work towards peace building, it was interesting to take a look and see 10 years later, 6 years later, what are the challenges facing, in particular, these children. So what we did to better understand this need, and sorry, one more point, we also wanted to do this to inform the ongoing work and advocacy within Uganda to pressure the national government to pass what they've been working on for several years, a national transitional justice policy, and in particular to provide reparations for those affected by conflict. So we hope that our study would be able to shed some light on the current situation facing these children and their mothers, and contribute to the advocacy efforts to apply pressure to the government of Uganda to take a needed response to address this issue. So we carried out consultations in the 4 subregions of northern Uganda, and we wanted to do that to understand what were the different dynamics of conflict, and to ensure that we weren't just looking at Acholi, which has been the focus of a lot of research because it also was where the most intense violations happened, but also to see beyond that how were other areas affected. And we worked very closely with our partners. This is not something we could have done alone. So we had local partners in each of the subregions who already were connected to either working directly with formerly abducted young mothers, their children, and they helped us identify participants with facilitation and translation. So over the course of 2 weeks, and with some preliminary interviews. We ended up speaking to a total of 229 participants, 135 female and 94 male. And you can see the list of some of the categories of people that we spoke to. And what we really made an effort to not just speak to those children born of war. Sorry, that's what CBW stands for, children born of war, or children born of conflict-related sexual violence, and their mothers. But since one of the key issues that we were interested in looking at was better understanding, like I said, the challenges they were facing now in the sort of a, could call it a post-conflict phase, and in particular of what has been very well documented in the research, the existence of stigma. And so since stigma is a social and communal phenomenon, we believed it was really important to speak to those community members that were a part of the life of these children and their mothers, and some of whom may be the ones also perpetuating the stigma, to better understand really what was going on. So we made efforts to speak to community members, teachers, cultural leaders, government officials at the local level, and what we found did really help provide a full view. So what I'm talking about today is a summary of a 40-page report, so if you are interested in getting much more detail and more quotes on the findings, I encourage you to look at our website and find the report, but now I'll just briefly summarize the key points, and then I look forward to some questions and comments. So what we found is that a clear absence of state support for those who had suffered conflict-related sexual violence and the children born as a result of that. In the immediate aftermath of the violations, the state failed to provide any targeted measures that would really help deal with the violation of sexual violence leading to motherhood. And what we found is that this lack of redress, compounded by discriminatory cultural norms, a patrilineal system of identity, scarcity of resources, and poverty, led to a situation where actually over time, rather than improve, we found that the situation for many had likely gotten worse. And this is both because of the lack of immediate state support, and like I said, compounded by these discriminatory norms and patrilineal system of identity, and also the absence of acknowledgement. So as Cheryl noted in her presentation, there is some discussion around truth-seeking, but there hasn't yet been a full process of truth-seeking or acknowledgement. So victims of the conflict haven't been officially acknowledged by the state. There also hasn't been an effort to clarify the multiple narratives about what happened and why and who is responsible. So what we found is that at the community level, sometimes there was what we could call a blame void, since no one has taken responsibility for the numerous atrocities and violations suffered not only by children and young people, but also by community members who stayed. That there was a blame void where I think it's only human nature that you want to look to someone as responsible for what you suffered, and in many cases, unfortunately, it was those that were closest and most vulnerable, these children born of war and their mothers. So to sort of summarize, the main finding of our report was that without adequate redress, and what I mean here by redress is the full range of approaches that would be needed to recognize the violations and the consequences of those violations suffered by children born of sexual violence and their mothers, and really understanding their needs, so providing reparations, truth-seeking, and acknowledgement. So without redress, we found that the consequences of motherhood as a result of conflict-related sexual violence multiply and amplify with time, in turn leading to a new series of violations that not only affect the women, so the formerly abducted young mothers, but also their children. So in a sense, it was sort of, we found a cascade of violations stemming from the first violation of sexual violence that hadn't been dealt with, hadn't been redressed. A new series of violations were continuing to affect the mother and the child. And not only that, what was really troubling is to see that it went from mother to child, but then also onto the next generation. And so, as you can see in the second quote here from a 17-year-old girl in Tubur, that's in the Teso subregion of northern Uganda, her grandmother, who we spoke with, had been raped, and as a result gave birth to her daughter, who was raped, and gave birth to her daughter, who was one that we spoke to, who also now had her own child. It was actually 4 generations that we met with. And the young 17-year-old girl, so as she told us the story, she was nursing her 3-month-old and told us she's also HIV positive. And the people that we were working with, informed her, you shouldn't be nursing your child. You may risk passing on the virus to your baby as well. And her answer was, yes, but I can't afford formula. And I think within that family, it was a sort of a portrait of they were violated by both government and LRA soldiers. It had gone on for 4 generations, and you saw that the cycle of discrimination, rejection, poverty, and exclusion was going to continue. So what we found was extreme rejection in the face of facing these women and their children. It got passed on from generation to generation, and for some, there was, especially we found this most prevalent in the Teso subregion, which is in part because of the dynamics of the different groups, Acholi versus Iteso, and who sort of was responsible for different atrocities. But those who were born in captivity and returned to Teso faced a lot of discrimination because their fathers were considered Acholi, and now they were back in a region of Iteso, and they were traditionally had been enemies. So we found a lot of evidence of these children who were born in captivity as being held responsible for the violations committed by their fathers. And as this quote shows, people in their community felt that almost it was their duty, their responsibility to pay for the sins of their fathers. So again, like the report, there are so many quotes that show the different impacts, but what we saw is really this tension, and I think this goes back to the point that Cheryl raised, that, well, internationally there's a norm that former child soldiers are to be considered victims and witnesses. And the challenge is that in many contexts, I found the same in Colombia and the same resonated here in northern Uganda. While that may be true from a legal international standpoint, the feelings of the community who are receiving these former child soldiers, and in the case of our study, these former child soldiers' children, the feelings don't at all represent this idea of them as innocent victims or witnesses, but rather they are seen as perpetrators. And not only is the woman who actually was abducted, but the child she returned with is seen as a perpetrator. Even if that child was born in the bush and came back at 3 months or 2 years and it's completely innocent, there's they never carried arms, they're never part of anything, the mere association with the rebel group in a context where there's been no acknowledgement, no redress for the violations suffered by everyone at the hands of these rebel groups and of the government army, led to a context where they were made to be held responsible. And I think this was exacerbated by the way in which culturally in Uganda identity is passed on from the father. So in this case, many times the children born in captivity return with their mothers, and sometimes they may know their father, sometimes they may not, but yet the shadow of their father's identity as being a rebel is enough to taint them and cause the community to reject them. But at the same time, they're not getting any of the benefits of having a father figure, which in Uganda is crucial for access to land and resources. So in a sense, these children born in captivity, have the worst. They have the negative association of being linked to the rebel group through their father, yet no access to the father's clan or resources. And in that context, it leads to a situation where it's extremely difficult for them to reintegrate and and take on a life of dignity. So it's really hard to go to school because there are no resources for school fees, and then that's where we found the cycle of violations perpetuates itself. So again, I'm glossing over, there were so many more very provocative and extremely disturbing quotes from our study. But in brief, I mean, what we found, as I said, is this case of extreme rejection being passed on from mother to child and continuing on for the next generation. So in that context, it seems there's an urgent need for official acknowledgement or an apology from the state, and there's some of the work that Cheryl talked about with some truth-seeking would go a long way to start addressing that. These remedies remedies from the state need to seek to redress the human rights violations and, importantly, from the perspective of children, the continuing impacts they have not just on the direct victim, the mother, but the child born as a result of sexual violence, understanding that there are long-term consequences. And importantly, to not forget the receiving communities who also suffered violations, because without addressing their needs and grievances, the process of accepting the young mothers and their children will continue to be difficult. And so a lot of our advocacy work, and we're continuing to work with our local partners now who helped us facilitate this, this research, is to keep pushing the government to provide access. There are some existing government programs around reconstruction and development that are supposed to reach those most vulnerable, including former child soldiers or formerly abducted young mothers, and we're finding that in practice it's not the case. So really thinking about how do we ensure and put some pressure on the government to do so. So in closing, I just want to share a few questions that we raised with government officials locally when we did a validation workshop of our findings before publishing the report. And I sort of kept these questions because I thought those of you who are online today, given your different backgrounds, maybe have also worked on this issue. And I think it'd be very interesting to get some of your thoughts. Because one thing that we really, discussed and is ongoing challenges, we want to draw attention to the extreme rejection and how that's impeding progress for these children born in captivity, children born of war. Yet they're already facing so much stigma and discrimination. How do you do that in a way that doesn't further their the challenges they're facing, or further the resentment faced by the community? And I think there's different ideas, but again, they're quite complicated to implement in practice. So it's question that we're continuing to think about, and would love to hear thoughts from those of you online. And similar to that is, what are the different ways, how can we eliminate stigma and discrimination, and really understand that it's not limited to name calling and nasty looks. It's really a rejection and ostracization that prevents these children born of war and their mothers from carrying on a normal life and being integrated fully into Ugandan society. And this is something that, as we saw from our research, is not going to go away by itself, but actually with time it could magnify and get worse as generation to generation continues to feel the impact of being excluded, not having sufficient access to resources, in part because of lack of a paternal clan, lack of resources, and exacerbated by rejection. So something needs to be done urgently. We hope that the advocacy efforts of local groups supported by different international groups will lead the government of Uganda to take some concrete steps. And then again, the challenge is how to make sure that those steps are beneficial and don't cause further division. So I'll end it there, and really look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginie. It's very interesting to see how work in the same region can take a different lens, but also arrive at some similar questions, considerations, and conclusions, as we saw in Cheryl's presentation. We do have a first couple of questions, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. We can go longer if people have the time and interest, but I do recommend that you type questions into the chat or the question box. The first two questions are for Cheryl, Dr. Heykoop, and they came in towards the end of or just after your presentation, and they are the following. One, what measures were taken during your research to prevent re-traumatization of the 107 young people involved? And secondly, someone has asked what the most unexpected or surprising finding from your research was.
Some great questions. So in response to the first question, it's something we certainly, in terms of what measures were taken to prevent re-traumatization, it's certainly something that we as a research team struggled with right at the beginning. We're like, how do we do this in a way that doesn't cause further re-traumatization? And one of the things is with the research, we weren't necessarily asking young people to share about their experience that happened during the conflict. So we weren't asking them to rehash that or to go over that again. What we were asking them was if they were to recommend how other young people could participate in a truth commission, what could that look like? Who would they talk to? What were some methods that could be used? What would they recommend other people to share or not share? So drawing from their own experiences, but not necessarily sharing those experiences per se. Some young people did share about them, but it definitely wasn't something that we expected through the research, and that was one way that we tried to mitigate the traumatization through the process. In terms of what was most surprising, it's a good question. And I think probably it is in relation to the ways that young people want to share. And many of the young people noted that they'd like to share individually, but also the notion that they would like to share in groups, and the importance of sharing in groups given that there's no support. So actually in sharing with other young people who've gone through similar experiences, it offers this natural support network where you can support each other. But again, in doing so, it needs to be done in such a way such that the information being shared isn't going to necessarily cause further harm or re-traumatization or stigma in the community. So I think it's recognizing that there's this balance where young people can be involved in truth-telling through individual processes, but also in collective processes, and recognizing that the collective process actually helps to rebuild and strengthen community.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. We have two more questions here. Both of these presentations have pointed out the need for the institutionalization or strengthening of the mechanisms around which that allow for children to engage in post-conflict transitions. And how would you recommend going about doing that? And secondly, how do we move, and I think both of these questions can apply to both of you, Virginie and Cheryl, how do we move from an acknowledgement of the need for redress and the need for service delivery to actually providing services or reparations? And a follow-on question to that, is there a difference between service provision and reparations? We heard both languages there. And so I'm not sure if the questions are quite clear, but I'll let you try and we can go back to the audience if we want some more clarification.
Great, thank you, Mark. I think for the first one, if maybe someone could clarify whether the question was in general or, yeah, I think maybe if you could send a clarification and whether it's more towards Cheryl or me, that'll help us. But I think on the second one about how do we move from an acknowledgement of need to providing direct services or reparations, and is there a difference between service provision and reparations? So yes, there is a difference between service provision and reparations, and when we talk about reparations, a very important aspect of reparations is acknowledgement, so that it's not just development, it's not just a gift, it's because there was a violation of rights. Now the government is recognizing that violation of rights and acknowledging that it should not have happened and trying to show some sign of an effort to not let it happen again. And in that process, to provide some small form of assistance to help overcome the consequences of those violations. Of course, there are some things that cannot be repaired, but it's more of a symbolic gesture with an attempt to try and provide some alleviation in the current context. And I think in terms of, so that's theoretically, but now in practice, when we, in the context of Uganda, you know, there's this transitional justice policy has been in the works for several years, and it continues to be stalled at a political level. I think, you know, for pretty clear reasons. I mean, dealing with recognition of violations, especially with Museveni is still in power now, and he was in power at the time of the violations. It's complicated. The need is so great. Resources are scarce. So that process has been stalled, and part of what we and other activists are trying to do is find other areas where perhaps we can tap into what is intended more as development. So right now there's something called the PRDP program. It's the Peace Reconstruction Development Program, and if I got that wrong, I apologize, but basically it's an effort to redevelop, especially northern Uganda, following the conflict. And so it's not reparations per se, but sometimes, you know, the work that we do is about trying to make the best of a difficult situation and trying to be strategic and see how can you push open the little cracks that exist. And what we were recommending in the short term is, since that program already exists, the funds are already there, is there a way to very clearly earmark these children and their mothers, and so that they get some assistance in the short term, and thinking that just even the fact that they would be very clearly earmarked and set aside as a special category deserving of this need could be a step towards acknowledgement, which is a step towards reparations. I'll leave it to you, Cheryl, if you want to pick up on the other question.
Yeah, I might just need clarification on what that on the question again.
Here's what we have in response. Both of these pieces show that consulting with young people yields important, actionable information. Who should be responsible for ensuring that young people are consulted? What form of institutional consultation or institutionalized consultation would you like to see in post-conflict settings? So it sounds like it is broader than Uganda, but building upon what you've learned in this setting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think, again, at sort of a theoret, well, actually morally and ethically in relation to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think we all have a responsibility to ensure that young people's voices are heard. Specifically, we look at Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think in practice, it's actually working with some local governments and NGOs to explore, and young people themselves to explore, how to best achieve that and how to best make that happen. I don't think there is a blanket way to involve young people, but I do think it's important to have those conversations with the necessary actors to determine a way to make that most effective and meaningful for young people themselves and within the broader context of community. I think in some of these communities where we're talking about who have been affected by conflict, young people rarely have a voice. So offering space for them to have a voice actually may have implications on cultural norms and practices. So it's ensuring that young people's voices are heard in a way that's culturally and contextually appropriate and offers their unique perspectives and insights, because I think they do have something to offer in terms of new and innovative ways to move forward.
Yeah, I agree with everything Cheryl said. I'll just add from where I sit, a lot of what the work focuses on is trying to raise awareness among those who are in the positions to establish these truth commissions or reparations programs, that we want to work with them as early on as possible so they include this as part of their work. And I think, as Cheryl noted, it's not just the responsibility of one individual, and what we found is that's an effective way of engaging young people in these processes is to link up with organizations that already do that. So whether it's a youth-led organization itself or child protection agencies that have the contacts, as was done in Sierra Leone and Liberia. So, or also, I mean, the education system is a great resource that we've recently published some work looking at the intersection between transitional justice and education and the opportunities. I mean, both understanding that education can be a site of violations, but can also be a site of great discussion and engagement around these issues. So I think it's something that's important to take into consideration early on and to be aware of not just checking the box, you know, we invite children to comment on this one thing and then we're done, but really to think about what are more sustained forms of engagement that also build sort of civic engagement in the long term.
Thank you for those replies. We have two more questions. These are for Virginie, and they're a bit linked, although they came from two different people. I think you'll be interested to hear them together. The first one is, how can services and interventions for mothers and children born out of war address psychosocial needs and not cause further discrimination in the communities? And the second one is around the question of acknowledgement. Did you notice signs of either willingness or resistance from parts of the communities or institutions to know more about what happened and then to acknowledge responsibilities and victimhoods? In either case, willingness or resistance, how do you think the community's reactions could be used in practice? Tough ones.
Yes, I was trying to jot it down. I almost wanted to have them repeated, but let me see.
I can reread it. Let's see. The first one's clear,
yeah.
I think. Okay.
Yes, just read the second one. That would be great.
Around the question of acknowledgement, did you notice signs either of willingness or resistance from parts of communities and institutions to know more about what happened and then to acknowledge responsibilities and victimhoods? In either case, willingness or resistance, how do you think this reaction from parts of the communities could be used in practice?
Great, thank you. Thank you both for excellent questions. Regarding the first, so how can services and interventions address these psychosocial needs without causing further discrimination? I mean, that was a topic of, as I said, sort of in my ending question of great conversation, because one proposal that some people pointed out in our consultations was sort of implementing informative action. But then there's already so much resentment and a feeling that these women and children are perpetrators, and then if they're seen to be receiving benefits, that will further fuel that fire of resentment and rejection. And we actually heard of some cases of women in the Teso region who had received houses, and then the community went and burned them down. So it's it's a very big question. I mean, I think the ideal answer is that if both these women and children's needs could be addressed immediately because they are so stark, while also finding some ways of addressing the needs of the community and trying to have more of a dialogue about the complicated nature and you know the very gray line between victim and perpetrator. But then in reality, you know, what does that look like and how do you do that is a whole other question. I think there are, from other country examples, instances where there's ways of linking targeted services to, for example, women who've suffered sexual violence in a way that the community won't know that they're getting those services, to protect them from the stigma and rejection that would come with that. For example, in East Timor, if you brought your child to his or her medical checkup, you could then, while that child is seeing the doctor, go see a counselor. And it was, you didn't have to go to a separate center and have it be so visible. But yeah, again, it's an excellent question. That's the source of ongoing discussion. regarding the acknowledgement, we didn't have as much of a chance to delve so much into that issue of whether people were willing or interested to know more about what happened and to acknowledge responsibility. We were able to get a little window into some of that when we went back to validate the findings before publishing the report, and we asked that question of the children born in captivity who had been part of our study. And I wasn't there, but my colleague who was there said that there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere in the room when the idea was presented. And I think it was presented as, knowing more about the past would help us in the present. So it was tried to be phrased in somewhat of a sensitive way. And I think with that particular group, because they're already so targeted and seen as responsible, I think there's a fear that if there's more information about what happened, that would mean more information about violations that some of these people may have been involved in. I mean, or not the children, but their mothers or their fathers, and it would further cause resentment or discrimination. But I think it'd be interesting to hear from Cheryl a little bit more about this. Because like I said, this is something that emerged from our assessment, but it wasn't the focus at the time of our questioning, so we haven't had a chance to really go back and explore that further. But it is something that I know other groups have been looking at local forms of dialogues and truth-seeking, and I think for some very focused level issues, like I think there was one dialogue done by JRP on sexual violence in this one town, and apparently bringing that issue publicly forward, talking about it, has helped to sort of reduce the phenomenon. But it's something that yes, warrants further exploration. Cheryl, perhaps you have more thoughts based on your research that was more focused on that?
Yeah, I can. Thanks so much. Great answer, Virginie. And I think we did explore that a little bit in the research, but again, it wasn't necessarily the primary focus. But what young people did say is that they, just sharing about what happened isn't enough, and they do want support in doing so. And one form of support is actually having these dialogues in community to actually address some of these issues. So. But again, I think one of the challenges is, like, for example, if we're talking about some of the challenges that young people who are born in captivity are faced with, or born of the LRA, how can we have those conversations in such a way so that those young people's voices are heard, but they're not necessarily discriminated against because they've been part of that discussion? So it's really trying to find a balance to be able to do it in such a way such that people understand the concerns and the challenges that people are facing, and then we figure out a way to move forward, and in moving forward, we're trying to address some of the issues that have been raised, such as stigmatization. So it's certainly a tricky issue, and yet so fundamentally important to be able to move forward, because we need to know how people are feeling and what they're experiencing. That needs to be acknowledged. We need to know what needs to happen in order for them to feel more comfortable and safe in their own community, and then how do we then move forward from there? So it's definitely complicated and messy, but I do think there's opportunity to have those conversations and to do it in a way that's meaningful for everyone involved.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for your very thoughtful presentations, your reflections, your very thoughtful answers to the questions that arose. We don't have any more questions at this time, so I would just like to give you the opportunity to give any closing remarks, and then we will wrap up.
Okay, great. I'll start. I think just in closing, it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to engage in a discussion with everyone online. I think so many of these issues are still in their infancy. I mean, we've only been looking at young people's engagement in these issues over the last 15 plus years. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions, and there's a lot of research that needs to be done. So I think the more we start discussing some of the complications and challenges, the more we can then decide how to engage young people in ways that are meaningful. And as Virginie mentioned earlier, how do we then engage them as active citizens in peace building and recovery efforts? But thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you. And Virginie?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. And I hope if there are any more thoughts or questions, please feel free to email me. I really look forward to hearing about different reactions or perspectives. My email is vladish@icdj.org. And I appreciate the very thoughtful questions, and as Cheryl said, also the chance to, I think, talk more about these issues and see, now there's several processes underway, under discussion in Colombia, South Sudan, Mali, in very different, very challenging contexts, and it poses a challenge, I think, for those of us focusing on work with children and young people, and how do we ensure that their perspectives and needs and their participation happens in a way that's safe, meaningful, and helpful both for them and for the overall process. So thanks very much for joining us today, and I look forward to hopefully an ongoing dialogue online.
Thank you both. Thanks to our participants. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, which will keep you informed of future webinars, publications, all sorts of news, you can do so at cpcnetwork.org. And a special thanks again to Cheryl and Virginie for their just very reflective insights today. And I hope that you all have a good rest of the day, be it the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.